The first thing Deb ever said to me was, "You won't last 2 weeks." She didn't say it to be cruel. She said it with the exhausted precision of someone who had seen this movie before. The big city person showing up with a big suitcase and eyes full of poetry about the ocean, then quietly disappearing the moment they realize the ocean doesn't actually fix anything. She leaned against the doorframe of her bar, arms crossed, coffee in hand, watching me struggle with a box that was clearly too heavy for one person. She didn't offer to help. She just watched. And somehow, even then, I couldn't look away. But before I tell you what happened next, if this kind of story is your thing, please hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below. Tell me, have you ever run away from something only to find the thing you were running toward was waiting there all along? I read every single one. Okay. Back to Crescent Cove. I had driven 11 hours from Chicago. 11 hours with one gas station stop, a bag of pretzels I didn't finish, and a playlist I built for Renee that I didn't have the heart to delete and didn't have the courage to play. The playlist just sat there in my phone, Renee's road songs, like a door I wasn't ready to open. I had driven past the Oregon border, then back south along Highway 101, where the trees get impossibly tall, and the fog sits on everything like a wool blanket. By the time I reached Crescent Cove, it was 6:47 in the morning, and the town looked like it was still deciding whether to wake up. The clinic was a low white building 2 blocks from the water, sandwiched between a bait shop and a real estate office that had a closed sign that looked permanent. Doctor. Harold had emailed me 3 times with increasingly clipped instructions. Arrive before 8. Park in the back. Do not use the front entrance before hours. He had the energy of a man who had spent 40 years building a very specific system and would rather retire than explain it to someone new. When I knocked on the back door, he opened it, looked me up and down and said, "You're the one from Chicago." Not a question, a verdict. I told him yes. He told me the room in the back was smaller than advertised, the hot water heater was unreliable, and that I should manage my expectations. I smiled. I was very good at managing my expectations. I had been doing it for 2 years, ever since the first specialist appointment, the first round, the first loss. Managing expectations was practically the only skill I had left. The room was, in fact, smaller than advertised. It had a cot that creaked when you looked at it wrong, a window that faced a fence, and a smell that was either old wood or the sea, or both. I sat on the edge of the cot and didn't cry, which I considered a personal victory. I unpacked 3 things: my stethoscope, a photograph of Renee at the kitchen table laughing at something off camera, and a small succulent that my friend Jody had pressed into my hands at the parking garage in Chicago saying, "You can't kill these. Even you can't kill these." I put the succulent on the windowsill. I put the photograph face down. I wasn't ready for her eyes yet. The grocery store was a 7-minute walk. I know because I asked the first person I saw, and that person turned out to be Deb. She was standing outside the Anchor, her bar, though I didn't know that yet, directing 2 guys unloading a truck. She had on a dark green Henley, sleeves pushed up, and she pointed left without looking at me and said, 7 minutes. Pastries are better at the gas station, though. Then she went back to shouting at the delivery guys. I walked to the store. I bought coffee, bread, and a box of cereal I didn't want because I needed to feel like a person who had a plan. On the way back, I passed the Anchor again. Deb was gone. The sign above the door had an anchor painted in navy blue, and below it, in smaller letters, Esther 2009. All are welcome, especially if you're buying. I laughed for the first time in I don't know how long. It wasn't much of a laugh, but it was mine. By noon, Dr. Harold had already told me twice that the previous nurse had lasted 8 months, and that he considered this a success story. By 2, I had reorganized the supply closet because it was either that or stare at the wall. By 4, a girl came in with a cut on her knee, announced her name was Sam, said her mom owned the bar, and asked me if I was the new person everyone was talking about. I said I didn't realize anyone was talking about me. She said, "Oh, everyone is. Small town. Nothing happens here." Then she looked around the clinic with genuine pity and added, "Until now, I guess." I didn't know then what she meant. I didn't know that her mother would become the reason I finally opened that playlist. I didn't know that Crescent Cove, with its fog and its creaking cot and its bar with the navy blue anchor, was not where I had come to disappear. I just didn't know it yet. Sam came back the next day. I hadn't invited her. Nobody had. She simply appeared at 3:15 in the afternoon, sat down in the plastic chair by the front desk, and announced that she was there for a follow-up on her knee. The bandage I had put on was a butterfly strip over a scrape that didn't even need a bandage. We both knew this. She knew that I knew. She pulled out her phone and started scrolling like she owned the waiting room, and I stood there in my scrubs holding a clipboard, wondering how a 15-year-old had more confidence in my space than I did. I asked her if her mom knew she was here. She said, and I quote, "My mom knows where the bar is and where the house is. Everything in between is kind of a free country." Then she looked up from her phone and added very seriously, "She's not like a bad mom. She's just a bad talker." I didn't know what to do with that information, so I did what I always do when I don't know what to do. I made tea. I made 2 cups. Sam accepted hers like she had been expecting it. That was how it started. Not with Deb. With Sam. She came back every afternoon that week, always with a different excuse, a headache, a splinter. Once a question about whether stress could make your hair fall out, which led to a 20-minute conversation about her history teacher that I was not qualified to mediate, but somehow did anyway. She talked the way some teenagers do, in long looping sentences that doubled back on themselves, and I realized after the 3rd visit that I had not thought about Chicago once while she was in the room. That felt significant. That felt like the closest thing to relief I had touched in months. By Friday, I knew the following things about Sam. She was a sophomore. She hated geometry but loved biology. She had a best friend named Priya, who had moved to Portland and now only texted in memes. She had never met her father and had 0 feelings about this that she was willing to examine. And she thought Crescent Cove was, in her exact words, a beautiful prison for people who gave up on being interesting. I told her that was a little harsh. She shrugged and said, "My mom says the same thing, and she's the one who stayed." I filed that away. I was filing a lot of things away. What Sam didn't know, what nobody in that town knew yet, was the full shape of what I had left behind. They knew I was from Chicago. They knew I was a nurse. Dr. Harold had apparently told the pharmacist, who had apparently told everyone, that I was overqualified and possibly running from something, which, credit where it's due, was accurate. But they didn't know about Renee. They didn't know about the baby we had named Mel before she was born and buried, without ever being held outside a hospital blanket. They didn't know that I had stood in our apartment 2 months after the funeral, and realized I couldn't remember what it felt like to want something. That's when I had found the job listing. That's when I had started driving. On Saturday morning, I walked to the Anchor because I wanted coffee and my room didn't have a coffee maker, which I was increasingly convinced was a deliberate choice by Dr. Harold to make my life difficult. The bar didn't open until 11, but the lights were on inside and the door was unlocked. I pushed it open and stood there for a second, taking it in. It was the kind of bar that had been the same bar for a long time. Dark wood, a jukebox in the corner that looked like it still worked, photographs on the wall behind the bottles, a chalkboard menu with the Tuesday special still written on it even though it was Saturday. Deb was behind the bar doing inventory. She had a pencil tucked behind her ear and a ledger open on the counter, and she did not look up when I walked in. She said, "We're not open." I said I just wanted coffee. She said coffee wasn't on the menu. I said the chalkboard said it was. She finally looked up, glanced at the chalkboard, looked back at me, and said nothing for a full 3 seconds. Then she turned around, poured a cup from the pot she had clearly already made for herself, and slid it across the bar. No milk, no sugar, no pleasantries. I sat on a bar stool and drank it. She went back to her ledger. The jukebox wasn't on. Outside, the fog was still sitting on the water like it hadn't decided to lift yet. It was the most comfortable silence I had been inside in 2 years, and I didn't know what to do with that either. I watched her work, the way she moved through her own space with a kind of absolute certainty, like every corner of that bar was an extension of her, like she had built it with her hands and her stubbornness and maybe some very dark years she had chosen not to talk about. I recognized that quality in a person. I had been wearing it myself for months. When I finished the coffee, I put the cup down and said, "Sam comes to the clinic every day." Deb wrote something in the ledger. I know. I waited. She didn't elaborate. I said, "She's a good kid." Deb looked up then, not a long look, just a flicker, the kind of look that checks whether you mean something or are just filling silence. Whatever she found in my face must have been acceptable, because she said quietly, "Yeah, she is." And then she went back to the ledger, and I understood, without either of us saying so, that the conversation was over. I walked back to the clinic in the fog. Sam was sitting on the front step with 2 gas station pastries, one for her, one apparently for me, and she looked up and said, "Did you go to the Anchor?" I said I had. She got this expression, caught somewhere between smug and careful, and said, "She gave you coffee, didn't she?" It wasn't a question. I told her yes. Sam nodded very slowly, like I had confirmed something she had been tracking for a while. "She doesn't do that," she said. "Like, ever." I told her it was just coffee. Sam bit into her pastry and said, "Sure it was," in the tone of someone who is 15 years old and absolutely certain they know everything. I had been in Crescent Cove for 18 days when the baby almost didn't make it. Her name was going to be Isla. The mother, a young woman named Petra who was 38 weeks and had driven 40 minutes on a logging road because the nearest hospital was in Eureka and there wasn't time, came through the clinic door at 11:20 at night, making the kind of sound that bypasses your brain entirely and goes straight to your hands. Dr. Harold wasn't answering his phone. It was me. A supply closet stocked for routine care. And 18 years of training I had spent the last 11 months trying to convince myself I still had. I stopped thinking about Chicago. I stopped thinking about everything. I just worked. Isla was born at 12:47 a.m. She cried immediately. That sound, that specific sound, the first cry, the proof of air in lungs, is the sound I had built my entire career around. It is also the sound that since Mel had become the thing I was most afraid of hearing, because it reminded me of the silence that had come instead. Every single time. But that night, when Isla cried, something shifted in the room that I can only describe as the air deciding to behave differently. Petra laughed and sobbed at the same time. I held it together until I had done everything that needed doing. Then I handed Isla to her mother, walked to the back room, sat on the floor next to the creaking cot, and pressed my back against the wall and just breathed. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for the adrenaline to drain out and leave whatever lives underneath it. Which for me is always grief, patient and reliable as tide. I thought about Mel. I thought about the night we had planned, Renee and I, the birth playlist, the bag packed by the door 6 weeks early because Renee was a planner down to her bone marrow. I thought about the drive to the hospital that was nothing like the drive we had rehearsed. I thought about Renee's face, and how she held my hand in that room, and how she was the stronger one that night, even though nobody should have had to be strong that night. The grief didn't ask permission. It never did. At some point, I put on my jacket and walked outside. I don't remember deciding to. I just found myself on the street, then on the path that cut between 2 closed shops and opened onto the beach. the fog had thinned enough to see the water, which was black and enormous and completely indifferent to everything happening on the shore, which was, honestly, what I needed. I sat in the sand. The tide was coming in. I pulled my knees up and looked at the Pacific and thought, I am 34 years old, and I don't know what I'm supposed to want anymore. It wasn't self-pity exactly. It was more like a status report, an honest inventory. I don't know how much time passed before I heard footsteps on the path behind me. I didn't turn around. I think I already knew. Deb sat down beside me in the sand. Not close, not far. Just close enough that I could feel the presence of another person without it being a demand. She was in a flannel jacket and worn boots, and she had clearly come straight from closing the bar, because she smelled like wood smoke and something faintly like cedar. She didn't ask me what I was doing there. She didn't ask if I was okay. She looked at the water. I looked at the water. The tide came in a little further. After a long time, she said, "Rough night?" I said, "Baby came early." She nodded. Heard the car. More silence. The waves were doing what waves do, which is continue, regardless. I said, "She's fine. The baby, she's fine." I don't know why I needed her to know that. Deb said, "Good. Just that. Just good." The way someone says a word when they mean several other words underneath it, and have decided for now to let the small one stand in for all of them. I don't know what made me say the next thing. Maybe it was the dark. Maybe it was the fact that she wasn't looking at me. Maybe it was 18 days of holding everything at a careful distance and being suddenly too tired for the distance. I said, "I lost a baby too. Not like tonight. Different." I didn't elaborate. She didn't ask me to. She just turned her head slightly, not toward me, just away from exactly straight ahead, and I heard her exhale, slow and deliberate, like she was making room for what I'd said inside the space between us, like she was taking it seriously. Nobody had taken it seriously in a long time without immediately trying to fix it. We sat there for another 20 minutes, maybe 30. At some point, her shoulder was an inch from mine, and neither of us moved away. The fog came back in off the water, soft and indiscriminate, covering both of us equally. I thought about saying something else. I didn't. There was a particular quality to the silence Deb built around herself. Not cold, not closed, just load-bearing. The kind of silence that holds weight without cracking. I had been surrounded by people who couldn't tolerate silence since Renee died. Well-meaning people who rushed to fill it with casseroles and calls and careful optimistic sentences. Deb just sat there. It was the kindest thing anyone had done for me in months. Eventually, she stood up, brushed the sand off her jacket, looked down at me with an expression I couldn't fully read in the dark, something between concern and restraint, like she had considered saying something and decided against it. What she said instead was, "There's coffee at the bar tomorrow morning. Doors unlocked at 7. Then she walked back up the path. I sat in the sand until the sky started to lighten at the edges, and then I walked back to the clinic, and I lay down on the creaking cot, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I slept. I showed up at the Anchor at 7:03 the next morning. I know it was 7:03 because I stood outside for 3 minutes talking myself into opening the door. Not because I was nervous, I told myself, because I wasn't sure if the invitation had been a real invitation, or the kind of thing people say in the dark on a beach at 3 a.m. that evaporates by morning. I had learned, in the last 2 years, not to count on things that were said in soft moments. Soft moments had a way of revising themselves in the daylight. I pushed the door open anyway. Deb was behind the bar. There were 2 cups already on the counter. She didn't look up, but they were 2 cups. That was the whole sentence. I sat on the same bar stool as before. She slid 1 cup toward me without ceremony and went back to whatever she was doing. which appeared to be repairing a section of trim on the underside of the bar with the focused irritation of someone who had been meaning to fix this for 6 months. The coffee was better than the day before, darker, stronger. And I wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at the photographs on the wall behind the bottles. There were maybe 30 of them, framed in mismatched frames, spanning what looked like decades. Fishing boats, storefronts, groups of people squinting into sun. In the corner of one, barely visible, a younger Deb with longer hair, laughing at something, her whole face open in a way that it wasn't now. I looked at that photograph longer than I meant to. She caught me looking. I expected her to say nothing, which was her established mode. Instead, she said, without turning around, 2011, 4th of July. My sister took it. I asked if her sister still lived in town. A pause. No. The pause told me not to follow that thread, so I didn't. I was getting better at reading the shape of the things Deb didn't say. There was a whole architecture to her silences. Some of them were just quiet, and some of them were walls. And the important skill was knowing which was which before you walked into one. I was learning the map. That was the morning Sam came in and blew the map entirely. She pushed through the door at 7:20 with her backpack half open and a piece of toast in her hand, and stopped when she saw me at the bar. Her face did something complicated, surprised, then pleased, then carefully neutral in about a second and a half. She slid onto the stool 2 down from me, looked at her mother, looked at the 2 coffee cups, looked at me, and said absolutely nothing. For Sam, absolute silence was the loudest possible response. Deb pointed at her without looking up and said, "Don't." Sam held up both hands, the picture of innocence, and asked if there was orange juice. The morning continued, but that was also the morning Sam told Deb about Mel, though she didn't know that's what she was doing. It came out sideways, the way Sam's most important statements always did, buried inside something else, slipped in between bites of toast. She was telling me about a school project on grief counseling, of all things, and she said, "Claire would know about that, right? Because of..." And then she stopped, looked at me, read something in my face that made her go very still. She said, quietly, "Sorry, I didn't know if that was..." I told her it was okay. It wasn't a secret. It was just heavy. She nodded seriously, the way she did when she was actually listening, and moved on. But the word had landed in the room, and Deb had heard it. She didn't say anything. She didn't react visibly. She just went still for a half second, a barely perceptible pause in whatever she was doing, and then continued. But something had changed in the barometric pressure of the room, the way it does when information enters a space and rearranges everything slightly, even though nothing looks different. I felt it. I didn't know what to do with it. I finished my coffee, said I had to get to the clinic, and left. I walked the 2 blocks in the cold morning air and told myself it didn't matter, that it was just a word, that Deb was just a person who made coffee in the morning and sat in the sand in the dark, and that was all it was, and all it needed to be. I was very convincing. I almost believed myself. What I didn't know, what I found out 3 days later from Ruthie, the pharmacist, who found out from the woman who did the bookkeeping for town hall, who had apparently been present, was that Deb had gone to the town council meeting that week, the one about the clinic. I hadn't known there was a meeting. Dr. Harold had mentioned the vote was coming but had given me no details, possibly out of a general policy of sharing nothing useful. The proposal on the table was a development plan. A resort company out of San Francisco wanted the land, the building, the whole block. They had money, and a PowerPoint, and a councilman who was very interested in their vision for boutique coastal tourism. Deb had stood up in that meeting, according to Ruthie, and said that the clinic needed to stay. Not as a speech, not with prepared remarks. Just stood up and said it, plainly, in the way she said everything, with the authority of someone who had been there long enough that the room listened. She said the town had a responsibility to the people who couldn't drive 40 minutes to Eureka on a logging road in an emergency. She said some things couldn't be replaced with a resort and a spa menu. Then she sat back down. The councilman tabled the vote, temporarily, but it had been tabled. I stood in the pharmacy listening to Ruthie tell me this, and felt something I didn't immediately have a name for. It wasn't gratitude exactly, though it was that too. It was more like recognition. The feeling of being seen by someone who had not announced they were looking. Deb had not told me about the meeting. She had not told me she had gone. She had just gone and done the thing, and come back to her bar and her ledger and her 2 coffee cups in the morning as though nothing had happened. I went back to the clinic, and I sat at the front desk, and I thought about that for a long time. About people who do things quietly. About how Renee had been that kind of person. About how I had forgotten that people like that existed. That afternoon, Sam came in. No pretense of an injury this time. She had given up on that. And sat in her plastic chair and said, "Did you hear about the meeting?" I said I had. She watched me carefully. "She doesn't do stuff like that for people," she said. "Just so you know." I told her I didn't want to read into it. Sam looked at me with the particular withering patience of a 15-year-old watching an adult be deliberately obtuse and said, "Claire, she made you a second cup before you even got there." I didn't have an answer for that. She pulled out her homework. I went back to work. But the second cup sat in my mind for the rest of the day, quiet and insistent, like a door that had been opened just enough to let the light through. I ruined it on a Tuesday. I am aware of how on-brand that is. It started with good intentions, which is how most damage gets done. The development company had sent a representative to town, a man named Fletcher, early 40s, the kind of aggressively pleasant that meant he was paid to be. And he had been making his rounds, talking to business owners, leaving folders with glossy renderings of what Crescent Cove could look like with a resort where the clinic currently stood. I had gotten a copy from Ruthie, who had gotten it from the hardware store owner, who had found it on his counter like a bad omen. The renderings were beautiful in the way that erasure is always beautiful. Clean lines, no history, nothing that had ever been inconvenient. I looked at the glossy version of the block where the clinic sat, and felt something cold move through me. I went to the anchor that evening to talk to Deb. This part I had thought through. What I had not thought through was how to handle what Ruthie had told me. That Deb's reason for fighting for the clinic was Sam's birth. That night, years ago, the emergency, the nurse who stayed. I had been carrying that information for days, turning it over, deciding it wasn't my business, deciding it was, deciding again. I walked in with the folder under my arm and a plan to discuss the vote, the timeline, what needed to happen next. Practical things, safe things. The bar was quiet, a Tuesday night in October, 2 fishermen at the far end, Deb wiping down the counter. I sat down. I put the folder on the bar. And then, because apparently I am incapable of sticking to a plan when it matters, I said, "Why didn't you tell me about Sam, about why you went to the meeting?" The temperature in the room didn't change, but something did. Deb set down the cloth. She looked at me with an expression that was very controlled and very tired and said, "Who told you?" Not a question. I said it didn't matter. She said it did. I said Ruthie. She exhaled through her nose and looked at the far wall for a moment and then back at me. "It wasn't your business," she said. I told her I wasn't trying to make it my business. I just didn't understand why she would do something like that and not say anything. She said, "Because I didn't do it for a conversation." I said I knew that. She said, "Then what do you want me to tell you?" And that was where I went wrong. Because what I wanted her to tell me was something I had no right to ask for yet. Something about why she had come to the beach that night. Why there were always 2 cups. Why she looked at me sometimes like she was doing math she hadn't finished yet. I wanted her to tell me something true about herself, And I wanted it because I was terrified of the alternative, which was that I was building something in my head that only existed there. I had done that before. I had confused kindness for something else before, in the year after Renee, when I was desperate and unmoored and reading meaning into things that were just people being decent. So instead of saying any of that, which would have been honest, I said, I just think if we're going to work together on this clinic thing, we should probably actually talk to each other. Deb looked at me for a long moment. Then she picked up the cloth and went back to wiping the counter. Good night, Claire, she said. That was Tuesday. Wednesday she wasn't at the bar when I went at 7. The door was unlocked, but the counter had one cup, her cup, already empty. She had come and gone. Thursday the door was locked. I told myself this was fine. I told myself I had misread the whole thing, and that was actually a relief, because now I didn't have to figure out what it meant. I was very busy telling myself things that week. Sam noticed. Sam noticed everything. She came to the clinic on Thursday afternoon and sat in her chair and looked at me with the diagnostic precision of someone who had spent 15 years studying one specific adult and said, "What did you do?" I told her nothing. She said, Claire. I told her it was complicated. She said, she shut down, didn't she? She does that. She did it with the last person who tried to get close, and she did it with my aunt after they had a fight about Thanksgiving, and she did it with me once in 8th grade for a whole week, and I had to leave apology notes in her coffee mug every morning until she cracked. I stared at her. She shrugged. She's not mean. She's scared. There's a difference. I asked her what her mother was scared of. Sam looked at me like I had asked what color the sky was. Same thing everybody's scared of, she said. Wanting something and not getting it. I thought about that for the rest of Thursday and all of Friday morning. I thought about it while I restocked the supply closet and while I ate cereal standing over the sink and while I lay on the creaking cot at night, listening to the foghorn somewhere out on the water. I thought about Renee, who had never once in 7 years been afraid to say what she wanted, who had walked up to me at a mutual friend's party, a stranger, and said, I've been trying to get your attention for 20 minutes, and you keep looking at the bookshelf, so I'm just going to tell you that I think you're beautiful, and then you can go back to the books if you want. I had not gone back to the books. I thought about what it had cost her, that kind of courage, and how I had never properly understood it as courage, because she made it look effortless. It wasn't effortless. It was a choice. It was always a choice. On Friday afternoon, Fletcher came to the clinic. He was very polished and very sorry to disturb me, and very interested in whether I had considered that the development plan would actually bring more healthcare infrastructure to the region eventually, in the long term, as part of their community investment framework. He had a folder. He had data. He had the smooth, load-bearing confidence of someone who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. I looked at him and thought about Mel and Renee and the drive along Highway 101 and the cot and the fog and 2 coffee cups on a bar, and I said, "Get out of my clinic." He blinked. I said it again, pleasantly. He left. Dr. Harold appeared from the back, looked at the door, looked at me, and said nothing. Then he went back to his office. For the first time since I'd arrived, I thought he might be almost glad I was there. That evening, I walked to the Anchor. It was 7:30. The bar was open. There were maybe 8 people inside. Deb saw me come in. She didn't move toward me or away. She just watched, hands flat on the bar, waiting. I walked up, and I didn't sit down because if I sat down, I would lose my nerve, and I had already lost it enough times for 1 week. I said, "I'm sorry I pushed. You do things your way, and your way it works, and I'm not entitled to an explanation for it." She looked at me steadily. I kept going. But I'm also not going to pretend that the last few weeks have been nothing, because they haven't been, and I think you know that. The bar was not quiet enough for this conversation. I was having it anyway. So, that's all. I just needed to say it. Deb was quiet for a long moment. Around us, the bar did its bar things. Murmur of voices, a glass set down, the jukebox starting up with something slow and old. Then she reached under the counter and put a key on the bar between us. I looked at it. "Back door," she said. 7 a.m. in case the door's locked. She held my gaze for exactly as long as it took for me to understand that this was, for Deb, the equivalent of a declaration. Then she picked up a glass and went back to work. I closed my hand around the key. It was warm from being in her pocket. I sat down at the bar, and Sam materialized from a booth in the corner where she had apparently been doing homework the entire time, and gave me a thumbs up that I pretended not to see. The vote was moved up to a Thursday. Nobody told me officially. I found out from Sam, who found out from the school secretary, who found out from her husband who was on the council, which is how information moved in Crescent Cove, not in straight lines, but in the particular spiraling pattern of a place where everyone had known everyone for long enough that the town functioned less like a municipality and more like one large extended family with boundary issues. Sam texted me at 6:47 a.m. Vote is Thursday, not next month. Fletcher's guy on council pulled something. My mom knows. I read it standing in the clinic doorway with my coffee from the Anchor, the one I had picked up with the back door key at 7, the one Deb had handed me without a word, and then gone back to the grill where she was making eggs for Sam. The key was on my keychain now. I had not made a big thing of this. Neither had she. That was how we were doing it. Quietly, in the language of small, consistent acts, which I was learning was Deb's native tongue. I went to the council meeting that Thursday evening knowing 3 things: that Fletcher's representative had the votes he needed unless something shifted, that Dr. Harold had written a letter which he had shown me that morning with the wordless gravity of a man presenting evidence in his own defense, and that Deb had not told me whether she was coming. I had not asked. The key was on my keychain. That had to be enough. The meeting was in the town hall, a wood-paneled room that smelled like old paper and heating vents, and it was fuller than I expected. Maybe 60 people, which for Crescent Cove on a Thursday night was essentially a stadium. I sat in the 3rd row. Dr. Harold sat beside me in his good coat, which I had never seen before, and which suggested he understood the stakes. Fletcher's man made his presentation. The renderings were on a screen. The boutique hotel, the spa, the revitalized waterfront. It was very beautiful. It was the future of a place that had no room in it for what the past had actually needed. The council chair opened the floor. 2 people spoke in favor. A landlord, a man who ran a seasonal kayak rental, and seemed to be calculating something in his head while he talked. Then an older woman named Bev, who had lived 3 houses from the clinic for 30 years, stood up and said that her husband had been brought there twice, and that the second time it had mattered, and she sat back down. A fisherman said the nearest hospital was too far on a bad night, and he knew because he had driven it. Dr. Harold stood and read his letter, in a voice that was steadier than I expected, and I realized, sitting there, that the difficult man who had told me twice that his previous nurse had lasted 8 months was also a man who had spent 40 years in that building and was not going to let it go without saying so properly. I had misjudged him. I had been doing that, misjudging people who kept things close, assuming the surface was the whole story, when I, of all people, should have known better. Then Deb walked in. Late. The door at the back opened, and she came in still in her bar clothes, flannel jacket, the worn boots, and she moved to the side of the room without looking for me, which meant she had already seen me when she came in and had made a decision about it. The council chair recognized her. She stood up and she didn't have notes. She never had notes. She just stood there in the wood-paneled room with 60 people watching and said what she said, plainly, in the way she did everything. She said the clinic had been there longer than the resort company had known this town existed. She said that on a specific night 15 years ago, she had walked through that door alone and scared, and the person inside had stayed with her until morning, and that you couldn't put a price on that, and you couldn't replace it with a spa and a seasonal menu. She said Crescent Cove took care of its own, and that taking care of your own meant keeping the things that were there when it was hard, not just the things that looked good when it wasn't. Then she sat down. The room was very quiet. The council chair looked at Fletcher's man. Fletcher's man looked at his folder. The vote went 4-2 to table the development proposal pending a full community review. The clinic stayed. People moved around afterward, talking, and I stayed in my seat for a moment because my legs had made a private decision not to work immediately. Dr. Harold stood, buttoned his coat, looked at me and said, "Good." Just that. Then he walked out. I understood that this was, from him, essentially a parade. I stood up and moved through the room toward the back, and Deb was near the door, talking to Bev. And when she saw me coming, she finished the conversation and waited. I stopped in front of her, and I didn't have a speech. I had used up my prepared remarks the Friday before at the bar, so I just said, "Thank you." She shook her head slightly, not dismissing it, just deflecting, the way she did with anything that came at her too directly. I said, "You don't have to do that. You can just take it." Something moved across her face. She said quietly, "Working on it." We walked back together without discussing whether we were walking back together. That was also how we did things. The fog was in off the water, thick and soft, and the streetlights made it glow faintly amber, and our footsteps were the loudest thing on the empty street. We stopped in front of the Anchor. She had to go back in. There were people holding the bar. She had left mid-shift. I knew this. I was going to say goodnight. That was the plan. And then she turned to face me under the amber light with the fog moving around us, and she said, "I'm not good at this." I said, "I know." She said, "I'm not saying that as a warning. I'm saying it because I want you to know I'm aware of it." I looked at her, at the careful, load-bearing person she was, the one who fixed trim under the bar and made 2 cups before anyone arrived and sat in the sand without asking for anything. And I said, "I'm not good at it either. I keep thinking I'm going to get it wrong." She said, "You probably will." I said, "So will you." She almost smiled. "Yeah," she said. "Probably." The kiss was not dramatic. It wasn't a movie kiss. No rain, no score swelling up from somewhere. No one watching. It was just Deb, who moved slowly and deliberately in everything she did, closing the distance between us in the amber light, and my hand finding the lapel of her flannel jacket, and the fog continuing to do what fog does, which is surround things gently and make the world smaller and quieter until there's only what's right in front of you. It lasted as long as it needed to. When we stepped back, she looked at me with that expression I had been trying to read for weeks, and I finally understood it. It wasn't math. It wasn't calculation. It was hope that had learned to be careful. I knew that expression. I had worn it myself. I touched her face once, briefly with my fingers. She closed her eyes. That was enough. That was everything. I went back to the clinic. I went to the back room. I had a box half packed in the corner. Old habit. Jody had called it a trauma response. She wasn't wrong. And I stood looking at it for a moment. I thought about the drive down Highway 101 with the playlist I hadn't opened. I thought about Renee, who would have had something to say about all of this. Something true and a little funny, and delivered with the absolute confidence of someone who believed that life was worth the trouble of living it forward. I thought about Mel, who had her mother's nose in the scan photo I still carried in my wallet, and who was the reason I understood, bone deep, that love was not a thing that ran out. You didn't get a fixed amount. It didn't diminish because it had been given before. It just continued, like tide, like fog, like a woman who made 2 cups before you even arrived because she had decided, quietly and without announcement, that you were someone worth making coffee for. I opened the box. I unpacked it. Every single thing went back where it belonged. Stethoscope on the hook. Photograph of Renee on the windowsill face up this time. Her laughing at something off camera, permanent and warm. The succulent on the sill beside her, still alive. Jody having been correct about its resilience. I sat on the edge of the cot. It creaked. It always creaked. And I opened my phone and I found the playlist. Renee's Road Songs. I pressed play. The first song came through the small phone speaker into the small room, and the fog pressed against the window, and somewhere 2 blocks away, the anchor's lights were on and would be for another hour. And I listened to the whole thing. Start to finish, for the first time. It was a good playlist. She had always had better taste than me. I cried a little, which was allowed. Which had always been allowed. I had just forgotten that too. The next morning at 6:58, I used the back door key. Deb was at the grill. Sam was at the counter doing homework she had clearly not done the night before, and she looked up when I came in and said with tremendous casualness, "So are you staying?" Deb pointed at her without turning around. "Sam." Sam held up her hands. I hung my jacket on the hook by the door. There was a hook. There had always been a hook. I had just never used it before. And I sat on my bar stool and said, "Yeah, I'm staying." Sam pumped her fist once, silently, under the counter. Deb set a cup in front of me and our fingers almost touched on the handle, and neither of us moved away. Outside, the fog was starting to lift off the water. It did that every morning eventually, held everything close, and then slowly let the light through. I wrapped both hands around the cup. I looked at the photograph on the wall. Younger Deb, longer hair, face open, laughing. I looked at the back of Deb's head right now, the gray starting at her temples, the pencil behind her ear. I thought, there you are. I thought, here I am. The ocean came in through the cracked window, salt and cold and enormous, and I breathed it in, and it tasted, improbably, like beginning.